Hi, well here we are in Egypt at the Wadi Degla Club in Nakheel in Cairo, and I'm going to share with you my 5 top tips for the ball toss on the serve. So number 1 may actually surprise some of you, but I actually don't believe personally that we should separate the ball toss from the serving action. And the reason for that is that because the only way to really develop the ball toss with control and precision is by actually having the opposite arm doing its thing at the same time. So if I work on the ball toss in isolation and I'm not actually using the throwing arm with the racket, actually I'm working on a different action here. So the first advice I would give you is to make sure that where possible you work on the ball toss with the racket doing its thing. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to hit the ball, but at least when you're working on the ball toss that you are getting into this throwing position here, so that this arm starts to feel that it's working under control whilst this arm is doing something different. We also know from studies that players who tend to work on the ball toss in isolation actually are throwing the ball higher generally than when they are working on the ball toss with the rackets doing its thing as well. So not only is it not particularly productive to work on the ball toss because it ignores the impact that this arm has on the serve, but also we know that it's not particularly realistic either. So number 1 actually is to try where possible to work on the ball toss whilst using the racket arm to at least get into the tick position or the pre-throw position, right? And if you actually want to work on the ball toss and hit the ball, then of course you can do that, but the focus perhaps is more on the ball toss and the precision and control of the ball toss than the racket itself. Number 2 is to make sure that when you are watching your players or working with your players, that you pay really close attention to the posture. What do I mean? Well, when we see players starting in this position here, if the first movement from this position is this, then an equal and opposite force results, and we end up with quite a wild and quite often out of control ball toss. So from here, the opposite reaction to that is this. And therefore we tend to see that players who start with a big drop down here of the front shoulder end up with a ball toss which is imprecise, out of control, or not appropriate. So number 2 is to make sure that you focus on the posture of the player and that the hinge for the ball toss is the shoulder and not the whole upper body dropping at the waist here. So we want to avoid this. We want to make sure that the chin is up, the head is up, the back is straight, the shoulder is the hinge, and the ball toss is coming from that position there. Number 3 is to make sure that the arm is straight. If we have any sort of kink or bend in the elbow, we're going to have problems. We need to make sure that the wrist is straight and that the palm is out and open. If we have any sort of flexion in the wrist, we're going to have problems. So make sure that the arm is working from the shoulder as a lever and that there are no kinks in either the elbow or in the wrist. Number 4 is to look out for the balance and the weighting on the 2 feet. If the weight is heavily on the front foot, okay, then we're going to end up with a ball toss that goes out well out in front. If we see that the weight during the ball toss is on the back foot, then you quite often will see that this front foot is going to move. It can move, it's free to move because the weight is on the back foot. So we want to make sure that the weight is not on the back foot, and of course the other thing is that it's going to pull the ball toss back towards me. I want to go forwards and then I end up with a contact point behind me. So I want to make sure that I start perhaps slightly on the back foot, but as I prepare to toss the ball, that I'm moving the weight slowly towards the front foot. So you'll see this. I'm actually maybe 60%, 40% on the back foot, maybe 70-30, starting here, moving forwards, and this helps me then to make sure that the ball toss is straight. So slightly on the back foot, moving forwards, and the ball toss out in front. Okay? So, to summarize, 70-30, 60-40, starting with the weight slightly on the back foot, good posture, that was number 3. Okay, for number 4, weight on the back foot, transition forwards, and at that point we release. Number 5 is to make sure that the players understand that the ball toss shouldn't be too far in front. The ball toss shouldn't be too far to the left, unless we're talking about good players. I'll come back to that in a second. We also don't want it too far to the right. So a really good place for the ball toss to be landing, if it were landing, is just fractionally inside the baseline. If the ball toss is too far in front, the racket is going to close over the top and we'll end up with the ball going down. So we don't want the ball toss too far in front. If the ball toss is too far to the right for a right-hander, then we're going to end up reaching for it here. Similarly, if the ball toss is too far to the left, we're going to end up arching backwards to try and make contact. So we want the ball toss to be fractionally to the right of the left foot, sorry. And we want to make sure that the ball toss is fractionally inside the baseline. That ball landed there. That allows me to be able to move forwards gently. Okay, contact just slightly in front of me, and for my weight to naturally transition into the court. Of course, if we're talking about better players, okay, we're talking about high-level players who have a good amount of leg drive and hip rotation, and where the shoulder rotation is more shoulder over shoulder rather than a horizontal rotation, then of course we'll be looking for a ball toss further to the left. But for our club players and our developing players, where the rotation is more of a horizontal rotation, then it would make sense that the ball toss is very slightly to the right. And as that rotation starts to change from horizontal to more vertical, then it would make sense that the ball toss is starting to go closer towards the left than the right. So those are my 5 top tips for looking at the ball toss on the serve.